Let's talk about sex. Now, forgive me for reading a lot of what I'm about to say, but I think it's important that I get this right. From PBS Parents, it was once thought that dyslexia is more common in boys than in girls, but recent research has shown that this is not the case. It is thought that boys are more likely to act out as a result of having a reading difficulty and are therefore more likely to be identified early. Girls, on the other hand, are more likely to try to hide their difficulty, becoming quiet and reserved. And then from the influential and very much respected Michigan Dyslexia Help, their website says, although it used to be thought that more boys experienced dyslexia than girls, current research has indicated that dyslexia occurs in approximately equal proportions. One possible explanation of this myth is that boys may be more likely to act out when experiencing difficulty, while girls may try to hide their trouble. So it seems to be the same kind of the same story here. Therefore, more boys will be recognised and diagnosed with dyslexia, falsely inflating the statistics. So there are three immediate questions that come to mind. The first question is what it means to act out, because this isn't yet quite specific. What does acting out mean, and what effect might that have on a dyslexia diagnosis or on a likelihood of a dyslexia diagnosis? The second question, of course, is whether this idea that boys behave like this and girls behave like that is actually quite stereotypical. Is it gender stereotyping? And the third question is, what do we mean by current research? I think these three questions need examining. So the first thing to say is that there is some evidence, anecdotal evidence, and also I've spoken to educational professionals who say that actually acting out, depending on what that means, if it means sort of playing up, becoming aggressive, being oppositional, this is less likely to get you a dyslexia assessment than it is to get you suspended or expelled from school. So the idea that if you act out, you're more likely to be given a dyslexia assessment, I don't know. I'm just not convinced by that idea. The second question, of course, is about gender stereotypes and cultures. So are all genders stereotyped the same way in all cultures? So for instance, in South America, do boys and girls act out in similar proportions as they might do in Russia, for instance, or in Peru they might act out in the same way that they do in Colombia, or they might not. And do they act out in the same way that they might in Ghana or in Finland? This idea that boys act out in a way that girls don't, first of all, it seems to be gender stereotyping, and second, it seems to be national and cultural stereotyping, and these are things we have to be a little bit careful about. So in terms of culture, for instance, in 2009, the European Commission reported that 13.3% versus 26.6% of low achievers at school were girls versus boys. So boys seem to be twice as likely to be low achievers as girls. And of course, in countries where gender equality has made more of an impact, these statistics may well change. The third thing, of course, is what we might mean by recent research. It turns out that when people say recent research, they usually mean one thing. A 1990 study by a very influential and very intelligent woman called Professor Sally Shaywitz. 1990. One piece of research in 1990. This is not recent research, and we have to be very careful about this. This research, by the way, was conducted among more than 400 school children in Connecticut. and it says, we hypothesized that results of previous investigations indicating an increased prevalence of reading disability in boys compared with girls reflected a bias in subject selection. In an epidemiologic sample of 215 girls and 199 boys, we identified two groups of reading disabled children, research identified and school identified. So research identified children and school identified children. Results indicated no significant differences in the prevalence of reading disability in research identified boys compared with research identified girls in either second or third grade. In contrast, school identification resulted in the classification of significantly more boys than girls. Our data indicate that school-identified samples are almost unavoidably subject to a referral bias, and that reports of an increased prevalence of reading disability in boys may reflect this bias in ascertainment. These findings caution against relying solely on schools for identification of reading disabled children. This was the piece of research that people quote. Very good piece of research, by the way. I am not knocking it. So let's just examine maybe the other side of this. Gentry, this is 2014. He asked this. He said, Google the question, are more boys than girls dyslexic, as we just did when we looked at the University of Michigan. Google the question, are more boys than girls dyslexic? And you'll get urban myth laced with moralizing, not science or good psychology. We need to end the urban myth. Quite cutting. And then, of course, he quotes, and we'll come to this lady soon afterwards, Dr. Genevieve Eden, Professor of Pediatrics at Georgetown University Medical Center. And he says, Dr. Genevieve Eden, Professor of Pediatrics at Georgetown University Medical Center, says that the prevalence, or says that female dyslexics differ from female non-dyslexics in ways that do not reflect the differences observed in males with and without dyslexia. So he seems to indicate that there is indeed some difference between female and male dyslexics. So we have on the one hand Sally Shaywitz, and on the other hand, in the red corner, as it were, Dr. Gentry. So let's examine some of the other supporting evidence. Okay, a study from a guy called Miles and others in 1998. Let me quote this. A study carried out in Great Britain on a national sample of 11,804 10-year-olds showed a ratio of 4.51 to 1 male to female dyslexics. And he compares this with Shaywitz's study, and he says that using the same, as he calls it, looser criteria that Shaywitz used, they found a ratio of 1.69 to 1 male to female dyslexics. In other words, Shaywitz's looser criteria for dyslexia produced far closer results than his more rigorous, strict clinical criteria for dyslexia. So depending on the criteria you use, you'll get different results for boys and girls. Then Arnott and others from 2018, let me quote them. It is now clear that we can divide the overrepresentation of males with dyslexia into two parts. One invalid part explained by referral bias, this is the Shaywitz hypothesis, and one potentially valid residual part found in epidemiological samples. The sex difference in referred samples of individuals with dyslexia is due in part to higher rates of externalizing behaviors among males with ADHD. Now this is interesting. While the smaller sex differences in epidemiological samples remains unexplained. So in 2018, Arnott showed that there were actually differences in sex or gender between male dyslexics and female dyslexics, and there were more, in fact, male dyslexics than female dyslexics. But that's not the whole story. Let's read on. Rutter and others from 2004, they based their findings on data from 4 large studies involving more than 10,000 children who had been given standard reading tests in New Zealand and Britain. And they say an influential article published in 1990, again they're referencing the Shaywitz article, an influential article published in 1990 claimed that the increased rate of reading disability in boys was a consequence of referral bias. But in all 4 studies that they looked at, the rates of reading disability were significantly higher in boys. The Dunedin study, 21.6% in boys versus 7.9% in girls. The Christchurch study, 20.6% in boys versus 9.8% in girls. The ONS, Office of National Statistics study, 17.6% in boys versus 13% in girls. And an E-risk study, 18% in boys versus 13% in girls. In other words, girls go from about 7.9 to 13%, boys go from about 18 to 21.6%. Or you could simply argue that boys in these studies are up to 3 times as likely to be dyslexic than girls, 2 to 3 times as likely. And then Dr. Martha Burns argues the male brain matures at a different rate. It seems to be more vulnerable to neurodevelopmental factors, so males generally have more learning disabilities. Krafnick and Evans in 2019, they agree. So Evans says at one point, there is a sex-specific variance in brain anatomy, and females tend to use both hemispheres for language tasks, while males just the left. So I don't know whether this is true, but this is what Evans claims. Krafnick and Evans then claim a string of recent work suggests that the brain basis of dyslexia may indeed be different in males and females. Dyslexia has higher odds ratios for boys compared to girls. And they then quote a number of other studies. I'll just quote 3 of them. Flannery from 2000, reading disability was about twice as common in boys than girls, irrespective of race, severity of disability, or exclusion of children with attentional disturbances or high activity levels. Katusic from 2001 says boys were 2 to 3 times more likely to be affected than girls, regardless of the identification methods applied. And Quinn and Wagner from 2013, they said in a large-scale study of reading impairment among 491,103 second graders, gender differences increased with greater severity of reading impairment, peaking at a ratio of 2.4 to 1 for a broad measure of fluency and a ratio of 1.6 to 1 for a narrow measure of decoding. I think it's also worthwhile saying that in 2018 there was a study in China, or on Chinese children, showing that girls with a particular, now I'm not going to make a fool of myself, girls with a particular gene or protein or something were less likely than boys with that gene or protein to develop dyslexia. I'd also like to mention a project that I was involved with called the Dyslexia Compass. And the Dyslexia Compass looked at different ways of measuring dyslexia across Europe. One of the findings was quite interesting. On the assumption that dyslexic mothers are more likely to give birth to dyslexic children than non-dyslexic children, or quite a high likelihood that a dyslexic mother will give birth to a dyslexic child, it turns out that in Romania there was some evidence, or there were some opinions at the very least, that dyslexic mothers are more likely to give birth to male children than female children. Now, if that's the case, then you can understand an increased prevalence of dyslexic boys over dyslexic girls. In this same study, it showed that diagnosticians were split on whether gender made a difference to a dyslexia diagnosis. They didn't think that it made a difference in their own particular diagnoses, but they did think, or at least there was a split in certain diagnosticians whether gender actually had an effect on how many boys are likely to be diagnosed as dyslexic than girls. And so this is quite interesting that even the diagnosticians disagree amongst themselves. I'd just like to say that the evidence isn't all on one side, though. So it's not Sally Shaywitz versus the world here. There is, for instance, evidence from Jimenez and others who performed a binational comparison of, I think it was Spain and Colombia, or Spain and a South American Spanish-speaking country. And they concluded there was no difference as a function of gender. There might have been a difference in how people measure for dyslexia, but even among those differences in how they measure for dyslexia, there was no difference in gender. So it's not that it's a slam dunk for the more males than females dyslexic side of the argument. There are others who do agree with Shaywitz, but it's not a universal agreement. So why do we need to get this right? Well, look, obviously there are two sides to this. On the one hand, if we're miscounting the number of female dyslexics, then we're not diagnosing them properly, we're not accommodating them properly, and we're creating essentially inequality upon inequality. On the other hand, if we're now starting to say something false, and it could be false, I'm not saying it is, but if we're starting to say something that could be false, such as there are just as many female dyslexics as male dyslexics, and the evidence shows the contrary, then not only are we being, as it were, disingenuous, not only are we going against the evidence, but we're starting to disadvantage other people. We're either giving out too many dyslexia assessments, or we're not giving out enough dyslexia assessments. If we don't get this right, then somebody, some group or another will be disadvantaged. That's the way this works. The only thing we can do is follow the evidence where it takes us. If that happens to be that the number of female dyslexics is vastly underestimated, then great. If it happens to be that actually there are more male dyslexics than female dyslexics, but websites are telling us otherwise, then we have to do something about that as well. So we need to follow the evidence. Whichever way we go, we need to be evidence-based rather than simply political about this. We can't simply say, this is what I want to be true, therefore this is what I'm going to say. We have to say, this is what is the case, and that's therefore what we have to deal with. Because if we don't, we create inequality needlessly. And needless inequality, to be honest with you, is one of the worst forms of inequality you could have.